Well, good morning. We are going to start giving some insights about unit number three. Number three is about the development of productive skills. When we talk about productive skills, we need to consider those skills that are used for producing language. When we talk about producing language, we need to start discussing about how we write, how we speak, but also what is behind writing, what is behind speaking. And before going deep into the idea of teaching writing or teaching speaking, we are going to start first of all discussing what's the perspective of teaching language in an integrated way. First of all, when we talk about teaching language in an integrated way, we need to focus on how we are going to make students aware of language features, for instance, grammar and vocabulary aspects, throughout something they can understand. When we talk about something they can understand is because we are going to start focusing on receptive skills. In this case, that students are able to understand what they read or what they listen. And then, based on that understanding, they are going to start using the language. In this case, they are going to write, they are going to speak, they are going to produce, in this case, a written or an oral text. And the idea of teaching integrated skills becomes not only popular, but also reflect of how communicative approach is enhanced. So, as you could see, there are two ways of viewing the four skills in English. Sorry. The first way, oops, I'm going back. The first way is like um, when you are learning a piece of grammar, for instance, you are going to start listening through tape recording a dialogue. And then the focus is that your students are able to understand what is that grammar point. And then after they are able to understand that grammar point, then you go explicitly to express that idea of, for instance, simple present when you reproduce a dialogue in which some people are discussing about their daily routine, for instance. This is one way of perceiving the four skills. After students are able to understand that message, then you express or explain the grammar point. After that, probably you give a handout in which they need to master that grammar point of daily routine just for first and second person singular, and then another lesson devoted for third person singular. So remember, when you are teaching simple present, the most advisable aspect is not to teach all the grammar rules at the same time. In one lesson, as I mentioned, you are going to teach first and second person singular, and after that, a handout with grammar aspects. Probably you may ask students to develop a short conversation in which they are going to use that vocabulary previously seen, the expressions for daily routines, and students are going to exchange with another pair what are their daily routines. Alternatively, you may ask students to write like a short diary. Well, the case of a diary, it's not exactly a real diary. It's just a pedagogical exercise in which you are going to ask in the morning, I, at whatever hour. Then in the afternoon, I, at whatever hour. At night, I, for instance, go to bed at whatever hour. So that's the idea of how you're going to see skills integrated. Then the second perspective that is described on the right side is how language, language elements can help students, in this case, for developing the skills. How students are going to master their listening skills, how they are going to achieve probably a standard in listening, and then what is necessary, why they need to master that ability. That's the second question. Why do people do these things? And third, how they are going to keep on practicing. That is the other part, number three. So the second perspective of teaching language skills integrated is more focused on training students with strategies. So your lesson, apart from teaching, for instance, vocabulary and grammar, is going to be more focused not on language aspect, but on strategies, how students are going to employ strategies for enhancing those language skills. So after we have presented these two aspects, we are going to move to the other in which it says, how can we teach these skills and strategies in English? Why? Because you are not going to teach separate. For instance, in one lesson, I'm going just to teach strategies for developing listening skills. And then in the second class, I'm going to teach the grammar and vocabulary aspects. That is not the way we are going to teach. Rather, we need to focus on how we are going to integrate teaching strategies and at the same time focusing on students developing the skills. Check. The first arrangement is going to focus on listening and speaking skills. How you are going to design a lesson in which, for instance, the same example, you are going to ask students to listen to a dialogue in which somebody is discussing about probably past memories, and then you teach the grammar aspect, vocabulary about memories, and after that, you ask students to develop a short conversation about past memories. So, in this lesson, I'm not talking about how many days this lesson will last. It will depend on, obviously, how you see your students are managing those skills. En the next course, in the planeación de la práctica docente, or the name it receives that next course, you will see how you are going to plan a lesson and you are going to consider time. You are going to consider also some aspects related to break down the contents of the lesson. Nevertheless, later I will try to give you some insights of how you can develop a lesson plan, because although it is beyond the scope of this learning subject, it's really necessary for you to start having a first approach on how to develop a lesson plan. The second arrangement is, for instance, you are going to give a reading passage in which students are going to retrieve information probably for future predictions. And after you give that reading passage, also you teach the grammar aspect probably well for future predictions. And after that, you ask students to write a short prediction for their future lives or something like that. So In this case, you are mixing a receptive skill, reading, with a productive skill, writing. Also, in the listening part, you are mixing a receptive skill with a productive speaking. So, the second arrangement, that is the one we are going to start developing, it's listening and reading, they are considered receptive skills. In contrast, speaking and writing are considered productive skills, and mainly the title of receptive and productive are all thanks to how the speaker or the listener receives information and produce information. So in this case, students are going to receive information by listening or by reading. You see, that's how you are going to consider receptive skills. When the means of communication it's something that you can listen to or something that you can read, that's the approach of receptive skills. In contrast, when the channel of communication is by oral, in this case, you are going to say something aloud, you are going to speak, or when you are going to ask someone to write down some ideas and then to produce a coherent text, that is the productive skills approach. That's exactly how we are going to start reviewing. This is the approach that we are going to take this for this time. We are going to first of all see and review what is writing and speaking as a productive skills, and later what is reading and sorry listening and reading as receptive skills. Then, when continuing with this explanation, first of all, we need to understand what are receptive skills. What is the source of information for receptive skills? So here you can see the source is what do people listen to and what do people read. Obviously, the channel of communication is something that is recorded or something that is written. In this case, when you read, mainly you are going to read in silence, but sometimes can also be done reading aloud. However, although you may say, well, but I'm producing something, I'm speaking, of course, but strategically, you as a teacher are going to center students' attention towards the ability of understanding, comprehending the message that they are reading. So, nevertheless, that they are speaking, reading aloud, in fact, you are devoting all the strategies so students are able to understand, comprehend what they are reading. Then the motivation in this case, for instance, listening and reading for enjoyment. What does that mean? Probably because you are a language learner that is interested in trying to understand your, probably if you are passionate about video games, probably you are interested in listening like a review of the newest video game. So that's like your inner motivation for understanding how I can comprehend what I am listening. And then you as a teacher have that opportunity of train your student with those listening skills. And then, for instance, listening and reading for information. Probably when you go abroad or your students go abroad, they need to listen or to read for survival. There is no way for them just to say, well, I don't know what does that says. I'm not able to understand something. So this is like an external reason. And this is another opportunity you as teachers have for engaging your students in listening and reading passages with a survival perspective. In this case, your listening and reading text should focus on factual information, something that can be considered of a survival necessity. Then skills and strategies. Obviously, how we are going to focus on strategies. Some strategies is like skim the text, extract information, scan for specific information, but also how you are going to make your students aware that those strategies are not only necessary to learn from a theoretical perspective. Obviously, you as a teacher need to say, well, this is scheming. Scheming consists in this, that, those. However, the most insightful part for your students is when you ask them to do the scheming and then you model how they are going to scheme the text, and for sure asking how they are doing that scheming process. What were their first insight? What were the final results? What did they learn throughout this process of scheming? That's the purpose, in this case, of teaching students reading and writing strategies. Sorry, reading and listening strategies, in this case of the receptive skills. And then how you are going to evaluate. Remember that this process of evaluation, as it says the question, what have I learned? What shall I do now? Consists not only in assigning a grade, rather on questioning your students how they did that process, how they experienced the use of those strategies, and within the answers your students provide, you will have a scope of how well your students are employing those strategies, and if not, that's the moment of making some adjustments in the teaching of those strategies. Probably is not worth for them or is not working for them. That's practical step at the beginning. Probably you may start by providing that theoretical information of the reading or listening strategies, and then you may need to guide step by step until they feel confident in applying that strategy. So that's the purpose of doing that kind of qualitative evaluation of the use of that strategy. So instead of just using numbers, you need to ask your students how they did that process of using strategies. So, how is or what is the shape of a receptive skills lesson? When we are talking about the text, remember that we are talking not only in the written form, but also in the oral form. In this case, a written text, a reading passage, an oral text, a listening passage. As it says before the text, so before you are developing that lesson, you need to have a balance between the topic, not only the grammar topic, but also the cultural aspect of the topic you are going to include in the text, the difficulty, and the type of tasks you are going to include within the lesson or lessons. Second, you need to introduce the topic before you move on to the text. What does that mean? Before you ask your students to read or listen to, You need to make sure that they know the topic. For instance, if you are going to provide a reading passage about the life of, I don't know, probably a historical politician of Mexico or another place, you need to make sure that they know at least some piece of information about the life of that politician, whether was he or she famous, and probably what was the most outstanding part of his her life. That is introducing the topic before you move to the text. Then after, no, sorry, before you start introducing the text, that is the moment in which you are going to ask students, do you know what's the purpose of this reading passage? Do you know what's the purpose of this listening passage? So they have a clear understanding of how they are going to read or to listen, what type of information they are going to focus, and how they are going to process extra information that is not really essential. Nevertheless, the text, oral or written, contains. En subject, lectura y redacción de textos académicos en inglés, obviously it's written text. I have always asked my students before reading the text, you need to question what's the text task. In other words, en Spanish. Primero tenemos que cuestionarnos cuál es la tarea del texto. ¿Por qué? Si tenemos un ejemplo, un artículo de investigación, ya lo tengo, léelo. No, no es nada más léelo. Tienes que identificar sus partes. A partir de haber identificado sus partes, también saber estratégicamente qué tipo de información voy a buscar y para qué la voy a utilizar. Esa es la tarea del texto. El que yo esté consciente para qué voy a utilizar esa información y no ponerme a leer de principio a fin el artículo de investigación. This is just an example. Then the second moment with the text, when you have this text, you need to give a simple task. For instance, in this case, recognize difficult words. This is a simple task. And then a more difficult task will consist on identifying between lines ideas. A medium task will consist in asking students to look for reference. For instance, the word "et" in line number 9 refers to, and then students need to go to that line trying to guess what is the referent of it. This is a medium task. Then the second aspect, make sure students are aware of the skills you are teaching. How you are going to make your students aware of the skills you are teaching? Well, in this case, you need to focus at the beginning of the lesson that you are rehearsing with them, for instance, scanning for information in the written text, for instance. And then obviously that's this moment in the second part in the with text. You are going to give like a theoretical explanation of scanning, what's the purpose of scanning, the advantages of doing scanning, and all that stuff. That's how you are going to make students aware of the skill and also the strategies you are teaching. After text, the last moment, what does that mean? It says show some connection between the new information and the students' lives. When you are finishing the lesson, It's also the moment of reflecting how well they did the scanning and also question if someone or sometime they are going to use scanning this strategy for reading, and of course how they are going to use that strategy in other contexts outside the classroom. For instance, if you are preparing students for a certification exam with that strategy, they need to be aware that what they are reviewing inside the classroom, it's worth for them for having a better result in their certification exam. Then we are going to review this approach of productive skills. First of all, when we are talking about productive skills, the first part says when students produce language, they are showing teachers what they have already learned in terms of grammar, vocabulary, but that as well how they are able to produce. It can be in the written form or in the spoken way. And also, the other part that you need to consider is communicating in the language is a part of the learning process itself. What does that mean? When you are approaching the productive skills way, you are going to allow your students to make errors. However, the point here is how they are going to be able to notice the mistake they did. First of all, you need like to be aware of what are the mistakes your students are producing. Probably you take note of those mistakes, and after your students have produced, for instance, in this case, in the spoken production, later you will provide general feedback of what were the mistakes you identified. Obviously, the general feedback will enhance students to pay attention, and obviously, they are not going to be exposed like you did this mistake, you made that mistake. No, you are just giving general suggestions of how your students can improve that speaking production. However, the idea is that the use of correction of language will or should be considered as encouragement, not as punishment, as I mentioned. The idea is that your students try to identify what were the mistakes they produced when speaking and when they are writing. Here, there are two ways you can provide feedback. The first way is like using a code for students to identify what was the mistake, probably spelling mistake, alternatively, a grammar, verb tense agreement, or another source of mistake probably is lack of coherence, lack of cohesion. So you are just probably highlighting the part in which you observe those aspects, and then you only use a code for indicating that error. And the task is that your students correct that mistake. Another approach for correcting the written assignment is providing some explanations of what was the source of error. And then you may provide an alternative form so they can correct that mistake. Also, you can provide like a brief note in which you make them to reflect on the idea, like what was the idea, what was the purpose of using this sentence or this clause. Probably this clause should be rephrased like this, or alternatively, pay attention to the use of punctuation marks. Why? Because you are writing a really long sentence that it's not really understandable for the reader. So you can take these two ways of providing feedback for a written task. Whatever of these two forms, you need to be consistent. You cannot mix both forms. You can use the coding or the other kind of feedback, like the explanation and making students aware of questioning how they can amend that idea. Then, when we are talking about productive skills, what is the source of language? Well, the types of language which people speak and write are the same ones which people listen to and read. What does that imply? Students need to be aware when you are asking, for instance, that students produce a dialogue. The common way is follow the example we review at the beginning. And this is okay because they are conscious of the use of some grammar or vocabulary aspects. And they are going to notice that exactly the text they listen to, it's a text they are going to produce in the oral form. Probably when students are reading about something, I don't know, probably predictions for the future, and then you ask students to write another kind of prediction, they are also going to notice that the same style, the text they read, it's probably the same style, the text they need to write. Then, skills and strategies. Obviously, the purpose is that students achieve a sense of unambiguously expression. The idea is that students understand where is the source of lacking of coherence, of cohesion, why that speech they are producing is not really able to be understood by a native language speaker. That's the purpose when you are teaching skills and strategies. And also that students are able to use the language appropriately for the people they are addressing. That's also the moment in which you are going to introduce some aspects of sociolinguistics, the use of this, that word, and the reasons why the use of those words will be suitable for the context of communication. Then, with the other part that says skills of language learning. Skills of language learning basically it's like a mixed between how students are able to use, for instance, if we can consider like a tool, the strategies for learning the language they are also producing. What does that mean? Check this is a square. Students discuss and plan what they want to say or write. Students take a model and personalize it. Control, freedom, and independence. Let's see what does each, and the final, students draft, receive comment, and redraft. Let's see one by one. When you ask students to write a text, you are going to start with the outline of the text. After that, you ask students, to start gathering information following the ideas they outlined. Then you ask students to start producing the paragraphs of their text. That's the first draft. Then they give you that first draft and they receive comments on your part. If the idea was clearly expressed, if there is something ambiguous, something that is not really easy to understand for the reader. In this case, you need to focus on students. The feedback I am providing to your piece of writing, it's based on what is expected for a reader of your text. So I'm not considering like the Punisher teacher, rather, as a reader of your text that is highlighting some inconsistencies in your text. That's more or less the approach you also need to adopt for providing feedback in the written text. And after your students receive that feedback, they need to write a second draft. Then probably the question is, how many drafts should I ask my students? Well, it depends on the scope of the course, the purpose, probably the time you have for providing a second draft, and so on. The other, students discuss and plan what they want to say or write. This alternative will enhance students' critical skills, thinking skills. For instance, they need to organize, decide on the topic, how they are going to present that topic, and of course, what are the sources they will need to employ for developing the speech or the written text. That's also the moment in which you are going to start supervising, monitoring students' work in the sense of just trying to be attentive. It's necessary, in case it is necessary, to provide feedback, to provide guidance. Then the other, students take a model and personalize it. This is commonly for beginners when you have a conversation model and then you ask students, you are going to produce a conversation similar to the one you could see on page 7 of your textbook, or similar to the one we saw at the beginning of the lesson. You need to change this, that, those aspects. This is an example of how students take a model and personalize it. And obviously, the characteristics or the elements that will be present when you are asking your students to produce a written or an oral text are controlled. They need also to take responsibility of the process they are following for constructing that text. Freedom and independence in the way you may ask students to you decide the topic you are going to produce this text. Probably the only limit, the only constraint is the length. You are going to ask for a specific length, and that's okay. Then we need to continue to finish this part of integrated skills. In this case, integrated skills is the mix of listening or reading plus converse and discuss and then speak and write. What does this pattern mean? As it says here, this pattern, I'm going to explain this pattern. provides a basis for all kinds of activities in which students can extend their control over the systems of language. And what are the systems of language? Vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and the skills of language use. For instance, you are going to start with a lesson, and then imagine the topic is discussing about Christmas. Then, within that cultural aspect, you may start by providing a reading passage in which it is presented three different ways of how Christmas is celebrated around the world. Then you may focus on language aspects, for instance, verbs, fixed expressions. So, this is how you are integrating that language system vocabulary. Probably because it contains some reported speech, then you are going to focus on that other grammar aspect. However, you are not going to teach those language systems separately. You are going probably to ask students to use those fixed expressions and those reported speech aspects in a short discussion, like trying to see similarities and differences between each country, how they celebrate Christmas. And then you say, you need to use those aspects of language, vocabulary, and grammar. After the students have done outline or probably the script of their discussion, you may ask now students to give that oral discussion in public, in plenary, in this classroom. And then, because they need to give that discussion, that's the moment in which, before they give that discussion, you assess or provide guidance. Before assessing, sorry, you provide guidance to your students so they can pronounce some words that they find difficult, and also that they take into consideration some aspects like intonation, intonation falling, intonation raising, and those suprasegmental aspects that are proper of a speaking. That is how you are going to develop in an integrated way your lesson. Wait a minute. Yes. So I stop sharing. I can listen any comment or question you have about this perspective of integrated, first of all. You can tell me, no matter if you want in Spanish or in English, something that have called your attention about this integrated skill fashion. Yes, Max, go ahead.
Buenos días. Quería preguntar, bueno, no sé si va también de acuerdo al tema, pero algo que vi fue lo más motivacional y lo que yo quería preguntar es si era cómo podrías hacer o encontrar la manera de que un alumno, en este caso, se pueda interesar en algo que no le motiva o no le genera algo, pero tiene que aprender aún así. ¿Cómo, cómo podrías ser el caso de que pueda aprender en eso.
Muy bien, Max, es interesante esta pregunta por dos razones. La primera, como profesores necesitamos también ir teniendo en cuenta el aspecto motivacional, no nada más hacia nuestra materia, sino en realidad a interesarse por aprender. Y entonces, una de las primeras alternativas antes de empezar a enseñar el contenido teórico es hacer una breve entrevista en la que se pueda plantear del estudiante cuáles son sus gustos fuera de la escuela relativos a, por ejemplo, actividades recreativas, actividades lúdicas, actividades que requieran, no sé, manipular objetos, por ejemplo, en el uso de un Jenga, o sea, de algún juego de mesa, de ajedrez o algo por el estilo. ¿Cuál es el propósito? Que a partir de esa información que tengamos, antes de enseñar el contenido de lengua, podamos tener ese intercambio de una experiencia vivida, por ejemplo, con un juego de mesa. ¿Por qué? Porque a partir de la experiencia que se tenga con ese juego de mesa, se le puede ahora sí asignar la tarea pedagógica. Descríbeme cómo te sentiste al haber participado en ese juego de mesa. ¿Ya lo conocías? ¿Cómo fue tu experiencia? ¿Qué aspectos de esa experiencia se te quedaron? Ahora que ya sabes, por ejemplo, un poco más sobre ese juego de mesa, ¿podrías enseñarle a alguien más? Y a partir de ese elemento de podrías enseñarle a alguien más, estaremos entonces ahora sí en posibilidad de, por ejemplo, mezclar. Vamos a ver cómo le enseñas a alguien más. Vamos a volver a jugar ese juego. Y entonces a partir de ahí podemos ir condicionando. A ver, pero mira, vamos a describir el paso a paso de cómo se debe de jugar. Y a partir de ahí empezamos a ir introduciendo poco a poco algunas nociones de la lengua inglesa. Como previamente también ya hicimos nuestro pequeño diagnóstico entrevista sobre qué tipo de actividades lúdicas le gusta, ahí también podemos ver sobre alguna música que esté en inglés. No sé, se me ocurre, es que le gusta el K-pop. Ah, bueno, ¿te gusta esto del K-pop? Mira, vamos a estudiar solamente el coro de esta canción que está de moda. ¿Te gusta? Y a partir de ahí entonces podemos otra vez retomar algunos elementos de lengua de esa estrofa de la canción. Poco a poco lo vamos, por decirlo así, enganchando a que se vaya interesando con aspectos de lengua. Y ya después, teoría, estímulo y respuesta. Vamos a seguir viendo esto, pero antes tenemos que ver la parte teórica de la clase. Y ya de ahí luego, ok, ya vimos esta parte teórica, ya estuviste repasando en la clase, ahora sí, vamos a tu elemento lúdico. Y poco a poco se va construyendo así como una simbiosis hasta que ya está más consciente el estudiante de que, ay, no, pues sí, sí me gusta la clase. ¿Pero por qué? Porque tuvo ese trasfondo de que se le atendió en su inquietud de aprender desde el inicio, desde lo que a él le gustaba, hasta ir trascendiendo al contenido lingüístico que me corresponde en mi clase. No sé si me di a entender.
Pues sí, la verdad creo que la entendí bien la idea del todo, de cómo quería ah, fijarse más en lo que el estudiante no entendía o cómo realmente lo motivaba o cuál es la razón del por qué está ahí, ¿no? Del por qué está en la clase, por qué quiere ver esto, está, poner su tiempo, su esfuerzo en ello y cómo lo interpreta en sí, cómo lo absorbe, ¿no? Y de esto pues va a partir de a partir de eso tiene como que sus dudas y esas se pueden responder si realmente le llega a interesar, ¿no? Pero pues a lo que entendí es eso.
Sí, efectivamente, Max, la intención es hacer consciente al estudiante de que independientemente de que la asignatura sea obligatoria, más allá de eso, que también puede tener un beneficio para su propia, ¿cómo podríamos decir? Para su propio ser, para su propia humanidad, va a tener un beneficio el que despierte a la realidad académica, pero justamente a partir de involucrar su interés y que no nos considere al profesor como una fuente autoritaria, más bien que puede entender sus necesidades desde lo anímico y puede trascender hasta hacerlo consciente del propósito de ¿para qué estás aquí en la clase? Mira, estas oportunidades de aprender, tú mismo con mi guía las estás descubriendo.
Mm. Bueno, pues ajá, creo que mi respuesta en sí ya, bueno, mi pregunta ya se ha resuelto. No sé exactamente qué pueda decir más al respecto. Que muchas gracias, profesor.
Sí, Max, para servirle. ¿Alguien más? ¿Algún aspecto les haya interesado, les haya llamado la atención? Y Fanny, adelante.
Bueno, para mí me pareció como importante ver que para enseñar cada habilidad de la lengua tiene que ser no estrictamente bajo un protocolo, sino que nosotros podamos entender que hay ciertas etapas que son importantes. Es decir, no es nada más darle al alumno, por ejemplo, un texto y es como de, ah, bueno, aquí está ese texto y dime qué te pareció la lectura, sino que de un solo, eh, ajá, una sola lectura, vaya, podemos sacarle mucho provecho si comprendemos de la manera más efectiva que hay como una etapa antes de la lectura, qué es lo que se puede hacer, cómo desarrollar este interés del alumno para que pues tenga esta fascinación por leer. Después, posteriormente, pues ya que venga aquí la lectura y al final, pues hacer no solamente que haya leído un texto y ya, sino que pueda desarrollar un pensamiento crítico y pues ese tipo de cosas, que nosotros podamos comprender qué tanto provecho le podemos sacar a, a una simple actividad y en base a eso desarrollar pues las em, productive skills y las, em, ¿cómo era? Receptive skills de un alumno.
Mire, Fanny, ahorita en lo que usted acaba de comentar, esa es también otra de las tareas que se tiene como docente. Más allá de querer hacer, o sea, fíjense, aquí el punto central es como docentes, tenemos altas expectativas de nuestra clase, así como también altas expectativas de nuestros estudiantes, y eso es muy bueno. Ahí viene un pero. También no lleguemos a frustrarnos por esas altas expectativas. ¿En qué sentido? Como lo hemos estado diciendo, primero necesito hacerme a la realidad que me toca vivir como profesor. A partir de esa realidad de saber qué tanto conocimiento de lengua tienen los estudiantes a los que les estoy enseñando, qué tan motivados están para asistir a mi clase, A partir de esa realidad, entonces tengo que ir también dosificando esas altas expectativas que yo tenga. Posiblemente la primera instancia sea conectar con ese ser humano al que yo le estoy enseñando algo. A partir de ahí entonces empiezo a valorar del gusto que tiene, no sé, mi estudiante por unos videojuegos. ¿Cuál fue el origen tal vez de uno de esos videojuegos? Y ahí puedo tener un tema para traerles una lectura. Y naturalmente tengo que ver si el texto como lo conseguí serán capaces lingüísticamente hablando de procesarlo o será necesario que lo modifique para que puedan ellos ser capaces de lingüísticamente hablando procesarlo y comprenderlo. Y a partir de ese texto, yo como profesor, ¿cómo puedo irlo adaptando para que no nada más se quede como, ah, sí, ya, fue el ejercicio de lectura, ok, y entra en pánico el profe, ¿y ahora qué hago? No, ese mismo ejercicio de lectura, el tema, me puede a mí dar la posibilidad de extenderlo ahora a una pequeña conversación sobre el tema, no sobre el texto, sobre el tema de la lectura. Posiblemente después de esa conversación pueda entonces ahora derivarlo en que escriban, no sé, un párrafo, puede ser tipo una reseña de ese texto o un párrafo en donde recomienden a lo mejor al videojuego del que habla ese texto y que den al menos una razón de por qué lo recomiendan. Y así fue como, a partir de un solo elemento, el texto, pude derivar en otras actividades para que produjeran lengua o también para que la pudieran comprender. Muchas gracias, Fanny, por su comentario. ¿Alguien más que le gustaría agregar algo, por favor? Well, if not, I'm going to continue with the other part, in which is teaching writing. We are going to start with the productive skills. And the first productive skill is writing. To begin with, we are going to briefly explore the nature of writing. So, there are some differences between written and spoken discourse. And which are those differences? Well, first of all, the first difference is, wait a minute, everyday life writing functions. For action, when you talk about for action, is like a written message. For instance, when you write a WhatsApp message, this is for action because you are asking your reader to do something. And at the same time, it is also for social contact. Why? Because you are asking that interlocutor, that reader, not only to do something, probably to reflect about the action you are asking to do. Obviously, based on a piece of information you are providing. And the other way it's for entertainment. For instance, when you are giving like a joke or something like that. And as well for entertainment can be expressed in a written text when you are probably writing like in Spanish, like the adivinanzas or something like that. Then the other difference, there are some features that distinguish spoken from written text. And which are those aspects? First of all, the structure and complexity. Obviously, when you are writing a text, for instance, an essay, it's longer than a speech. And of course, that essay will have a complexity like following the introduction, the arguments, the conclusion. And then you need also to use some structures that does not allow shortened versions. In this case, you are not going to use reduced forms that in speaking they are allowed. The other part is the grammatical metaphor. The grammatical metaphor implies this aspect. I'm going to provide an example for understanding this point. I wanna do my best decision. This is in the spoken part. Then for the written version, to be honest, I would like to be able to decide on a productive decision. This is the written form. Both aspects follow a grammar structure. They are trying to express a wish. In the first part is shorter, and of course it used a reduced form. In contrast, in the written form, you try to expand the text, but you are not using reduced form. So the first text, the spoken one, sometimes is considered ungrammatically because it doesn't follow the grammar rules. And the second one, it does. It is grammatically. But try to think about if you are producing poetry. Sometimes grammar rules with poetry are not followed. So the written text in this part of the poems does not follow a structured grammar rule and it may be considered ungrammatical. Something sometimes is considered like the spoken text. So that is the metaphor. To what extent you can consider that a written text is grammatically correct? Well, you need to have the lenses of the teacher. In this case, if you are going to teach, like students, you are going to produce a text and probably an essay, an argumentative essay, okay? You need to provide all the tools so your students follow grammar patterns and all those aspects. In contrast, if you are going to teach poetry, you are going to provide students with, first of all, an explanation that with poetry, some grammar rules are not going to be followed. And that is also part of the context. Sometimes written texts are mostly used for academic purposes, whereas spoken texts are not only used for academic purposes but are more commonly employed for daily life communication. And then the other part, time and space, especially permanence. Written text tends to be permanent. Why? Because if you edit a Word file, obviously, unless everything goes okay and it doesn't be damaged, the file, it will remain forever. And of course, books and other texts that are printed, they permanent. And in contrast, if you produce a speech and if you don't record the speeches you produce, they are not going to be permanent. So the words I expressed 10 minutes ago are not going to be produced anymore unless I record those words. Then other features, for instance, explicitness. What does explicitness mean? Written text tends to express in a direct way the writer's intention. Sometimes, depending on the type of text you are producing, sometimes the explicit intention is deduced between lines, reading between lines. Sometimes, when you are producing a spoken text, something that is very explicit is when you are using the words you try to communicate the message. And because spoken text tends to be shorter than written text, that's why you need to focus on explicit words to transmit the message. Density, as in my first example, written text tends to be more dense than spoken ones. Why? Because the use of words and some other expressions. Then the other expression, that is detachment. Detachment means in the written text that all paragraphs need to be tied in a cohesive way. So the first paragraph depends, sorry, the second paragraph depends on the first paragraph. The third paragraph depends on the second paragraph, and so on. So you are making like a chain. And if some ideas are introduced abruptly, that detachment is not going to be preserved in the written text. So that's why you need to use these course markers and other aspects that make the reader aware of how the ideas are connected. And this is also linked with organization and language. Language, in this case, the words, the vocabulary you are going to employ, and also associated with the register. If that written text is addressed for a person who you don't know or for a person who is a friend of you. But as well, no matter if you employ a high or low register in terms of language, the text must be ordered in a logical way. For instance, if you are writing an email for your friend, of course you need to follow like reading the main content of the message and the ending. So you are not going to start with the main purpose of the message and then you are going to say, hey, hello. So it is also an organized text. And of course, the other aspects is the standard language. The idea of getting more people for read your text, you need to use a common language. For instance, you are going to produce an essay about your thoughts on, I don't know, a controversial topic. You need to use common language that every reader can understand without any difficulty. And finally, aspects related to production. For instance, slowness of production. When you are writing, probably handwriting or on word processing, you need to start thinking, write a sentence, then think again, write another sentence, think again, and so on. So when you write a text, it's a slow process. In contrast with speech. With speech, you need to be quite faster than when you are writing a text. Obviously, you use signs and symbols, the letters in this case, punctuation marks as well. The other, sheer amount and importance. In this case, the text will adopt as if it was like a person, something that may capture your reader's attention. And this can be in the way you are introducing the topic, probably the style you are adopting in the written text for getting your your readers' attention to agree or to disagree with one idea you are providing in your text. That is the sheer amount. And the importance, in the case of importance, it's how you are going to give the words the relevance you want to express. For instance, you can use intensifiers, some adverbs, any other aspect that makes your text to be considered relevant for your reader. Obviously, in the written text, the participants are you and an unknown reader, in contrast with the spoken discourse. In this case, I know that I'm speaking to my students, so I know my participants. But in the case of a written text, you are the only one who are going to be free to express the ideas, and then you probably don't know who is going to be your reader. And finally, the product. The spoken part, the spoken text, as it says, the product is just a string of words, or in this case, a string of sounds. In contrast, the written product, as its name says, is something that can be decoded because the audience who is reading your text is able to decode the signs and symbols you used and that you printed in a sheet of paper or in an electronic document. So those are the aspects related to differences between written and spoken discourse. Then you need to remember also that writing can be considered as a means or as an end. And what does each perspective implies? First of all, as a means, writing is writing is simply used either as a means of getting the students to attend to and practice a particular point, or just as an exercise for them to practice and develop the writing skills. Examples of using writing as a means. For instance, you ask your students to write a postcard in which they talk about the activities they did last summer. The final product is a written text in which you are going to see if your students are using correctly simple past verbs. So the means in this case is the written text for assessing the correct use of simple past verbs. Then the other perspective as an end, written forms at the level of word or sentence, handwriting or typing, spelling or punctuation. For instance, in this case, the purpose of writing the postcard is for students to express what they did. And then you are going to focus exactly on the correct use of punctuation marks. Nevertheless, when you are designing a lesson, you cannot only focus on the perspective of writing as a means or writing as an end. You have to adopt a balanced perspective, as both the writing of anecdotes to illustrate the meaning of idioms combines writing with vocabulary practice. That's how you are, or commonly, you are going to design a lesson on writing. You have to consider writing as a means for practicing vocabulary and grammar, but also as an end to enhance students' correct production. In this case, in the use of punctuation marks. Then we are going to start focusing on different types of classroom writing performance. When we talk about classroom writing performance, we need to be aware of how students are going to develop written tasks, how they are going to participate in the elaboration process, and as well how your students are going to personally identify their mistakes and how they try to solve them. So the first part is an imitative or writing down perspective or performance in this case. What is the imitative? In the example, you are going to ask students just to fill in some blanks. You have a written text about the same topic, about past memories. And then the idea is that they complete the text, the gap text, only with simple past verbs. This is kind of imitative writing. Why? Because they are going just to focus on some patterns of language. In this case, they was the simple past verbs. The second perspective, intensive or controlled practice. Instead of just filling the blanks with the verbs, you may provide some prompts and then students need to complete the prompts so they can practice also the use of punctuation marks. You can start like on my last vacation, this is one prompt. The following prompt. Once I return from vacation, and then they need to continue. This is the intensive or controlled. Self-writing. Self-writing implies the task of saying, okay, students, now you are going to produce a short paragraph in which you are going to tell me how was your last holiday and what activities you did. This is self-writing. It's more open than the previous one. Then the other one is display writing, but display writing may have three parts. For personal reason, vocational or technical, or academic. Academic display writing is when you are going to be assessed through a probably standardized test or a certification test. And then they ask to write a text, probably an essay, a letter to the editor, in which you need to describe some aspects. This is the academic part. The vocational or technical display writing, it can be seen in how they, or the students, or they can write, for instance, a curriculum vitae. And the other display writing for personal, it's exactly when students have a diary in which they may give their personal accounts on how well they are performing at school. And the final part, the real writing. The real writing may adopt some ideas of the display writing, but in this case, you are going to design a task, like for instance, you are going to ask like an appointment for having a job interview. Write your cover letter in which you present to the chief of the organization and then mention when you are able to have your job interview. This is kind of real writing. Then there are some principles for designing writing techniques. The first principle says incorporate practices of good writers. And what are those good writers? Then, first, good writers have a look at the first draft so they are able to correct. Another good practice, good writers read before delivering the final draft for correcting inaccuracies. So those tips, in the form of a tip, you can also ask your students to do. Second principle, balance process and products. Process implies using organization strategies. Also, the use of an outline, the use of some dictionaries just to consult some vocabulary, and as well the product, in this case, the written text. Students are not going only to focus on delivering an excellent product. However, they need also to follow some steps during the process of writing. That's how you are going to focus with your writing lessons. Then account for cultural literary backgrounds. Remember, when you are asking to write a piece of text, you need also to provide some previous background knowledge on the topic they are going to write. It's not just like asking, hey, students, write a text about this or that. No, you need to provide that cultural literary background. Principle number 4, connect reading and writing. In the previous examples that I have explained to you, we need to start probably with a written passage, a reading passage, and then after they read, they speak about the content. Now they need to write about the topic of that reading passage. Number 5, provide as much authentic writing as possible. Probably not all your lessons are going to be devoted like for students to write a really, really creative piece of writing. But some in a while, you need to ask your students to create a text of their own experiences, of their own lives. Number six, frame your techniques in terms of pre-writing, drafting, and revising strategies. Those techniques will allow your students to be able to how organize ideas, how they can look up for information of the text they are going to write. This is pre-writing. Then drafting. At the moment they are, and also outlining. This is the pre-writing stage. The drafting stage implies when your students are indeed writing the paragraphs, and also at the moment they have written the paragraphs, how they are going to assess themselves the clarity of the ideas, if the paragraphs are neatly organized, if there are some inaccuracies in the use of vocabulary, how they are going to evaluate themselves to solve those problems. This is the releasing stage. Number seven, sensitively apply methods of responding and collecting your students' writing. Number seven implies some strategies you can use when you receive the text and then you start collecting, for instance, some I don't know, spelling mistakes, some inaccuracies in the use of terminology, and instead of just showing off a particular case, you may have that collection and then you may provide for all students in general like recommendations of how you can solve these, that, those problems. Number eight, clearly instruct students on rhetorical, formal conventions of writing. Obviously, those aspects should also be part of your writing lesson. Why they need to give some space, why they need to use the indentation aspect, for instance, la sangría, indentation, and why they need to use the APA formatting and style, and all those aspects need also to be clearly explained to your students. And finally, evaluating students' writing. There are some categories for evaluating students' writing. First of all, content. Obviously, the thesis statement, the idea is clearly stated, related ideas, how they are going to join some ideas inside the paragraph, development of ideas through personal experiences, like providing examples, and also the focus of the topic sentence is really developed within the paragraph. The second, organization. The introduction really presents the topic, then logical sequence of ideas. Also that the text have a conclusion and the text is appropriate in length. So it's not too short, not too long. Then aspects related to discourse. The topic sentence is properly stated. Also, the paragraphs have a clear cohesion, then the use of discourse markers, transition words, the rhetorical conventions, also how fluent is the discourse, if it is not repetitive or if it is not redundant. Then aspects of syntax, remember the use of period, semicolon, colon, full stop. It's also related with syntax and mechanics, the use of citation and references, if it is applicable, and the use of adequate vocabulary. So those aspects, in general terms, will guide your students to focus on how they are going to correct their written assignments. And of course, for you, those aspects can be considered for developing your evaluation tools like a rubric, like estimative scale, or a checklist. And then I stop here with writing. Now, I would like to listen to any one of you some aspects that have called your attention about nature of writing and how to teach writing. Either in Spanish or in English, something that have called your attention about teaching writing.
Uh, well, I think like one thing that caught my attention was mostly, well, in general, about having certain balance in class. Like the example of uh, writing as a means or writing as an end. It is important to distinguish between both and use them to have like variety in class. In general, I think that's the thing about balance. At the end of the day, adding more things or viewing class in different ways, using different methods, will help and will help improving the quality of our class. And again, in this topic of um, writing as a means, writing as an end, it could also be like extended to, well, to in general to language as a whole. It's similar to seeing language as the study topic or seeing language as well as the tool that you use. Mm, I think in more modern methods, sometimes we tend to see language more as a tool. We have stopped seeing it as as a topic that we study. But in my personal opinion, we still need sometimes to see like this other part of language uh, of viewing it in a more traditional way, especially us that we are foreign language learners, in comparison to second language learners, that they will be more benefited from viewing it as the tool that you use.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your comment. Exactly, that's the purpose of presenting these two perspectives. You, as language teachers, need to little by little enhance your students' idea of perceiving that obviously it's necessary, it's important to study language per se. Nevertheless, the most valuable aspect for them, for your students, is to conceive language as a means for communication. And then that's why for your students to reflect on that aspect, it's really necessary that you have that balance between you are going to write, for instance, you are going to write an essay. Well, but it's not just because you are going to deliver to me the essay. Behind writing the essay, it's a series of cognitive processes that me, as your teacher, I will guide you so you are able to develop those cognitive processes, and as well you can use language throughout those languages processes. All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your comment. I don't know if someone else have any other comment, any other question about the nature of speaking. Sorry, and the nature of writing. Yes, Evelyn.
In my case, I think that it is interesting how reading and writing are connected because if you don't read, you don't are able to write properly, depending on the context. In this case, well, academic context. So I think that is important read because they are people or students who are not very keen on reading. So I think it's important to connect these abilities. So it's incredible for me. Not incredible, but it's interesting.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, for your comment. Exactly, the purpose of this theoretical explanation is like to raise an awareness of, okay, first of all, you as a student, you are also identifying those theoretical aspects, but then you as future teachers start reflecting on how you develop your writing skills and then how you can complement your future students' writing skills development in this case. All right. Thank you so much for everyone's participation.